Chapter 2. Ivan Ilych's life had been most simple and most ordinary, and therefore most terrible. He had been a member of the Court of Justice and died at the age of 45. His father had been an official who, after serving in various ministries and departments in Petersburg, had made the sort of career which brings men to positions from which, by reason of their long service, they cannot be dismissed, though they are obviously unfit to hold any responsible position, and for whom, therefore, posts are specially created, which, though fictitious, carry salaries of from 6,000 to 10,000 rubles that are not fictitious, and in receipt of which they live on to a great age. Such was the Privy Councillor and superfluous member of various superfluous institutions, Ilya Efimovich Golovin. He had 3 sons, of whom Ivan Ilyich was the second. The eldest son was following in his father's footsteps, only in another department, and was already approaching that stage in the service at which a similar sinecure would be reached. The third son was a failure. He had ruined his prospects in a number of positions and was now serving in the railway department. His father and brothers, and still more their wives, not merely disliked meeting him, but avoided remembering his existence unless compelled to do so. His sister had married Baron Greff, a Petersburg official of her father's type. Ivan Ilyich was le phénix de la famille, as people said. He was neither as cold and formal as his elder brother, nor as wild as the younger, but was a happy mean between them, an intelligent, polished, lively, and agreeable man. He had studied with his younger brother at the School of Law, but the latter had failed to complete the course and was expelled when he was in the 5th class. Ivan Ilyich finished the course well. Even when he was at the School of Law, he was just what he remained for the rest of his life, a capable, cheerful, good-natured, and sociable man, though strict in the fulfillment of what he considered to be his duty. And he considered his duty to be what was so considered by those in authority. Neither as a boy nor as a man was he a toady, but from early youth was by nature attracted to people of high station, as a fly is drawn to the light, assimilating their ways and views of life and establishing friendly relations with them. All the enthusiasms of childhood and youth passed without leaving much trace on him. He succumbed to sensuality, to vanity, and latterly, among the highest classes, to liberalism, but always within limits which his instinct unfailingly indicated to him as correct. At school, he had done things which had formerly seemed to him very horrid and made him feel disgusted with himself when he did them. But when later on he saw that such actions were done by people of good position, and that they did not regard them as wrong, he was able not exactly to regard them as right, but to forget about them entirely, or not to be at all troubled at remembering them. Having graduated from the School of Law and qualified for the 10th rank of the civil service, and having received money from his father for his equipment, Ivan Ilyich ordered himself clothes at Sharma's, the fashionable tailor, hung a medallion inscribed Respice Finem on his watch chain, took leave of his professor and the prince, who was patron of the school, had a farewell dinner with his comrades at Donnan's first-class restaurant, and with his new and fashionable portmanteau, linen, clothes, shaving, and other toilet appliances, and a travelling rug, all purchased at the best shops, he set off for one of the provinces where, through his father's influence, he had been attached to the governor as an official for special service. In the province, Ivan Ilyich soon arranged as easy and agreeable a position for himself as he had had at the School of Law. He performed his official task, made his career, and at the same time amused himself pleasantly and decorously. Occasionally he paid official visits to country districts where he behaved with dignity both to his superiors and inferiors, and performed the duties entrusted to him, which related chiefly to the sectarians, with an exactness and incorruptible honesty of which he could not but feel proud. In official matters, despite his youth and taste for frivolous gaiety, he was exceedingly reserved, punctilious, and even severe. But in society, he was often amusing and witty, and always good-natured, correct in his manner, and bon enfant, as the governor and his wife, with whom he was like one of the family, used to say of him. In the province, he had an affair with a lady who made advances to the elegant young lawyer, and there was also a milliner, and there were carousals with aides-de-camp who visited the district, and after-supper visits to a certain outlying street of doubtful reputation. And there was, too, some obsequiousness to his chief and even to his chief's wife. But all this was done with such a tone of good breeding that no hard names could be applied to it. It all came under the heading of the French saying, "Il faut que jeunesse se passe." It was all done with clean hands, in clean linen, with French phrases, and above all, among people of the best society, and consequently with the approval of people of rank. So Ivan Ilych served for 5 years. And then came a change in his official life. The new and reformed judicial institutions were introduced, and new men were needed. Ivan Ilych became such a new man. He was offered the post of examining magistrate, and he accepted it, though the post was in another province and obliged him to give up the connections he had formed and to make new ones. His friends met to give him a send-off, they had a group photograph taken and presented him with a silver cigarette case, and he set off to his new post. As examining magistrate, Ivan Ilych was just as comme il faut and decorous a man, inspiring general respect and capable of separating his official duties from his private life, as he had been when acting as an official on special service. His duties now, as examining magistrate, were far more interesting and attractive than before. In his former position, it had been pleasant to wear an undress uniform made by Sharma and to pass through the crowd of petitioners and officials who were timorously awaiting an audience with the governor, and who envied him as with free and easy gait he went straight into his chief's private room to have a cup of tea and a cigarette with him. But not many people had then been directly dependent on him. Only police officials and the sectarians when he went on special missions, and he liked to treat them politely, almost as comrades, as if he were letting them feel that he who had the power to crush them was treating them in this simple, friendly way. There were then but few such people, but now, as an examining magistrate, Ivan Ilych felt that everyone without exception, even the most important and self-satisfied, was in his power, and that he need only write a few words on a sheet of paper with a certain heading, and this or that important self-satisfied person would be brought before him in the role of an accused person or a witness, and if he did not choose to allow him to sit down, would have to stand before him and answer his questions. Ivan Ilych never abused his power. He tried, on the contrary, to soften its expression. But the consciousness of it and the possibility of softening its effect supplied the chief interest and attraction of his office. In his work itself, especially in his examinations, he very soon acquired a method of eliminating all considerations irrelevant to the legal aspect of the case, and reducing even the most complicated case to a form in which it would be presented on paper only in its externals, completely excluding his personal opinion of the matter, while above all observing every prescribed formality. The work was new, and Ivan Ilych was one of the first men to apply the new code of 1864. On taking up the post of examining magistrate in a new town, he made new acquaintances and connections, placed himself on a new footing, and assumed a somewhat different tone. He took up an attitude of rather dignified aloofness towards the provincial authorities, but picked out the best circle of legal gentlemen and wealthy gentry living in the town, and assumed a tone of slight dissatisfaction with the government, of moderate liberalism, and of enlightened citizenship. At the same time, without at all altering the elegance of his toilet, he ceased shaving his chin and allowed his beard to grow as it pleased. Ivan Ilych settled down very pleasantly in this new town. The society there, which inclined towards opposition to the governor, was friendly, his salary was larger, and he began to play whist, which he found added not a little to the pleasure of life, for he had a capacity for cards, played good-humouredly, and calculated rapidly and astutely, so that he usually won. After living there for 2 years, he met his future wife, Praskovya Fyodorovna Michael, who was the most attractive, clever, and brilliant girl of the set in which he moved. And among other amusements and relaxations from his labors as examining magistrate, Ivan Ilych established light and playful relations with her. While he had been an official on special service, he had been accustomed to dance, but now, as an examining magistrate, it was exceptional for him to do so. If he danced now, he did it as if to show that though he served under the reformed order of things and had reached the 5th official rank, yet when it came to dancing, he could do it better than most people. So, at the end of an evening, he sometimes danced with Praskovya Fyodorovna, and it was chiefly during these dances that he captivated her. She fell in love with him. Ivan Ilych had at first no definite intention of marrying, but when the girl fell in love with him, he said to himself, "Really, why shouldn't I marry?" Praskovya Fyodorovna came of a good family, was not bad-looking, and had some little property. Ivan Ilych might have aspired to a more brilliant match, but even this was good. He had his salary, and she, he hoped, would have an equal income. She was well-connected and was a sweet, pretty, and thoroughly correct young woman. To say that Ivan Ilych married because he fell in love with Praskovya Fyodorovna and found that she sympathized with his views of life would be as incorrect as to say that he married because his social circle approved of the match. He was swayed by both these considerations. The marriage gave him personal satisfaction, and at the same time it was considered the right thing by the most highly placed of his associates. So, Ivan Ilych got married. The preparations for marriage and the beginning of married life, with its conjugal caresses, the new furniture, new crockery, and new linen, were very pleasant until his wife became pregnant, so that Ivan Ilych had begun to think that marriage would not impair the easy, agreeable, gay, and always decorous character of his life, approved of by society and regarded by himself as natural, but would even improve it. But from the first months of his wife's pregnancy, something new, unpleasant, depressing, and unseemly, and from which there was no way of escape, unexpectedly showed itself. His wife, without any reason, de gaieté de cœur, as Ivan Ilych expressed it to himself, began to disturb the pleasure and propriety of their life. She began to be jealous without any cause, expected him to devote his whole attention to her, found fault with everything, and made coarse and ill-mannered scenes. At first, Ivan Ilych hoped to escape from the unpleasantness of this state of affairs by the same easy and decorous relation to life that had served him heretofore. He tried to ignore his wife's disagreeable moods, continued to live in his usual easy and pleasant way, invited friends to his house for a game of cards, and also tried going out to his club or spending his evening with friends. But one day, his wife began upbraiding him so vigorously, using such coarse words, and continued to abuse him every time he did not fulfill her demands, so resolutely and with such evident determination not to give way till he submitted, that is, till he stayed at home and was bored just as she was, that he became alarmed. He now realized that matrimony, at any rate with Praskovya Fedorovna, was not always conducive to the pleasures and amenities of life, but on the contrary often infringed both comfort and propriety, and that he must therefore entrench himself against such infringement. And Ivan Ilych began to seek for means of doing so. His official duties were the one thing that imposed upon Praskovya Fedorovna, and by means of his official work and the duties attached to it, he began struggling with his wife to secure his own independence. With the birth of their child, the attempts to feed it and the various failures in doing so, and with the real and imaginary illnesses of mother and child, in which Ivan Ilych's sympathy was demanded, but about which he understood nothing, the need of securing for himself an existence outside his family life became still more imperative. As his wife grew more irritable and exacting, and Ivan Ilych transferred the center of gravity of his life more and more to his official work, so did he grow to like his work better and became more ambitious than before. Very soon, within a year of his wedding, Ivan Ilych had realized that marriage, though it may add some comforts to life, is in fact a very intricate and difficult affair, towards which, in order to perform one's duty, that is, to lead a decorous life approved of by society, one must adopt a definite attitude just as towards one's official duties. And Ivan Ilych evolved such an attitude towards married life. He only required of it those conveniences, dinner at home, housewife, and bed, which it could give him, and above all that propriety of external forms required by public opinion. For the rest, he looked for light-hearted pleasure and propriety, and was very thankful when he found them. But if he met with antagonism and querulousness, he at once retired into his separate, fenced-off world of official duties, where he found satisfaction. Ivan Ilych was esteemed a good official, and after 3 years was made assistant public prosecutor. His new duties, their importance, the possibility of indicting and imprisoning anyone he chose, the publicity his speeches received, and the success he had in all these things made his work still more attractive. More children came. His wife became more and more querulous and ill-tempered, but the attitude Ivan Ilych had adopted towards his home life rendered him almost impervious to her grumbling. After 7 years' service in that town, he was transferred to another province as public prosecutor. They moved, but were short of money, and his wife did not like the place they moved to. Though the salary was higher, the cost of living was greater, beside which 2 of their children died, and family life became still more unpleasant for him. Praskovya Fedorovna blamed her husband for every inconvenience they encountered in their new home. Most of the conversations between husband and wife, especially as to the children's education, led to topics which recalled former disputes, and these disputes were apt to flare up again at any moment. There remained only those rare periods of amorousness, which still came to them at times, but did not last long. These were islets at which they anchored for a while, and then again set out upon that ocean of veiled hostility which showed itself in their aloofness from one another. This aloofness might have grieved Ivan Ilych had he considered that it ought not to exist, but he now regarded the position as normal, and even made it the goal at which he aimed in family life. His aim was to free himself more and more from those unpleasantnesses and to give them a semblance of harmlessness and propriety. He attained this by spending less and less time with his family, and when obliged to be at home, he tried to safeguard his position by the presence of outsiders. The chief thing, however, was that he had his official duties. The whole interest of his life now centered in the official world, and that interest absorbed him. The consciousness of his power, being able to ruin anybody he wished to ruin, the importance, even the external dignity of his entry into court or meetings with his subordinates, his success with superiors and inferiors, and above all his masterly handling of cases, of which he was conscious, all this gave him pleasure and filled his life, together with chats with his colleagues, dinners, and bridge. So that on the whole, Ivan Ilych's life continued to flow as he considered it should do, pleasantly and properly. So things continued for another 7 years. His eldest daughter was already 16, another child had died, and only one son was left, a schoolboy and a subject of dissension. Ivan Ilych wanted to put him in the school of law, but to spite him, Praskovia Fyodorovna entered him at the high school. The daughter had been educated at home and had turned out well. The boy did not learn badly either. Chapter 3. So Ivan Ilych lived for 17 years after his marriage. He was already a public prosecutor of long standing and had declined several proposed transfers while awaiting a more desirable post, when an unanticipated and unpleasant occurrence quite upset the peaceful course of his life. He was expecting to be offered the post of presiding judge in a university town, but Hape somehow came to the front and obtained the appointment instead. Ivan Ilych became irritable, reproached Hape, and quarreled both with him and with his immediate superiors, who became colder to him and again passed him over when other appointments were made. This was in 1880, the hardest year of Ivan Ilych's life. It was then that it became evident, on the one hand, that his salary was insufficient for them to live on, and on the other, that he had been forgotten. And not only this, but that what was for him the greatest and most cruel injustice appeared to others a quite ordinary occurrence. Even his father did not consider it his duty to help him. Ivan Ilych felt himself abandoned by everyone, and that they regarded his position with a salary of 3,500 rubles as quite normal and even fortunate. He alone knew that with the consciousness of the injustices done him, with his wife's incessant nagging, and with the debts he had contracted by living beyond his means, his position was far from normal. In order to save money that summer, he obtained leave of absence and went with his wife to live in the country at her brother's place. In the country, without his work, he experienced ennui for the first time in his life. And not only ennui, but intolerable depression. And he decided that it was impossible to go on living like that, and that it was necessary to take energetic measures. Having passed a sleepless night pacing up and down the veranda, he decided to go to Petersburg and bestir himself in order to punish those who had failed to appreciate him and to get transferred to another ministry. Next day, despite many protests from his wife and her brother, he started for Petersburg with the sole object of obtaining a post with a salary of 5,000 rubles a year. He was no longer bent on any particular department or tendency or kind of activity. All he now wanted was an appointment to another post with a salary of 5,000 rubles, either in the administration, in the banks, with the railways, in one of the Empress Maria's institutions, or even in the customs. But it had to carry with it a salary of 5,000 rubles and be in a ministry other than that in which they had failed to appreciate him. And this quest of Ivan Ilych's was crowned with remarkable and unexpected success. At Kursk, an acquaintance of his, F.I. got into the first-class carriage, sat down beside Ivan Ilyich, and told him of a telegram just received by the governor of Kursk announcing that a change was about to take place in the ministry. Pyotr Ivanovich was to be superseded by Ivan Semyonovich. The proposed change, apart from its significance for Russia, had a special significance for Ivan Ilyich because by bringing forward a new man, Pyotr Petrovich, and consequently his friend Zakhar Ivanovich, it was highly favorable for Ivan Ilyich, since Zakhar Ivanovich was a friend and colleague of his. In Moscow, this news was confirmed, and on reaching Petersburg, Ivan Ilyich found Zakhar Ivanovich and received a definite promise of an appointment in his former Department of Justice. A week later, he telegraphed to his wife, "Zakhar in Miller's place. I shall receive appointment on presentation of report." Thanks to this change of personnel, Ivan Ilyich had unexpectedly obtained an appointment in his former ministry, which placed him 2 states above his former colleagues, besides giving him 5,000 rubles salary and 3,500 rubles for expenses connected with his removal. All his ill humor towards his former enemies and the whole department vanished, and Ivan Ilyich was completely happy. He returned to the country more cheerful and contented than he had been for a long time. Praskovya Fyodorovna also cheered up, and a truce was arranged between them. Ivan Ilyich told of how he had been feted by everybody in Petersburg, how all those who had been his enemies were put to shame and now fawned on him, how envious they were of his appointment, and how much everybody in Petersburg had liked him. Praskovya Fyodorovna listened to all this and appeared to believe it. She did not contradict anything, but only made plans for their life in the town to which they were going. Ivan Ilyich saw with delight that these plans were his plans, that he and his wife agreed, and that after a stumble, his life was regaining its due and natural character of pleasant lightheartedness and decorum. Ivan Ilyich had come back for a short time only, for he had to take up his new duties on the 10th of September. Moreover, he needed time to settle into the new place, to move all his belongings from the province, and to buy and order many additional things. In a word, to make such arrangements as he had resolved on, which were almost exactly what Praskovya Fyodorovna, too, had decided on. Now that everything had happened so fortunately, and that he and his wife were at one in their aims, and moreover saw so little of one another, They got on together better than they had done since the first years of marriage. Ivan Ilych had thought of taking his family away with him at once, but the insistence of his wife's brother and her sister-in-law, who had suddenly become particularly amiable and friendly to him and his family, induced him to depart alone. So he departed, and the cheerful state of mind induced by his success and by the harmony between his wife and himself, the one intensifying the other, did not leave him. He found a delightful house, just the thing both he and his wife had dreamt of. Spacious, lofty reception rooms in the old style, a convenient and dignified study, rooms for his wife and daughter, a study for his son. It might have been specially built for them. Ivan Ilych himself superintended the arrangements, chose the wallpapers, supplemented the furniture, preferably with antiques, which he considered particularly comme il faut, and supervised the upholstering. Everything progressed and approached the ideal he had set himself. Even when things were only half completed, they exceeded his expectations. He saw what a refined and elegant character, free from vulgarity, it would all have when it was ready. On falling asleep, he pictured to himself how the reception room would look. Looking at the yet unfinished drawing room, he could see the fireplace, the screen, the whatnot, the little chairs dotted here and there, the dishes and plates on the walls, and the bronzes, as they would be when everything was in place. He was pleased by the thought of how his wife and daughter, who shared his taste in this matter, would be impressed by it. They were certainly not expecting as much. He had been particularly successful in finding and buying cheaply antiques, which gave a particularly aristocratic character to the whole place. But in his letters, he intentionally understated everything in order to be able to surprise them. All this so absorbed him that his new duties, though he liked his official work, interested him less than he had expected. Sometimes he even had moments of absent-mindedness during the court sessions, and would consider whether he should have straight or curved cornices for his curtains. He was so interested in it all that he often did things himself, rearranging the furniture or rehanging the curtains. Once, when mounting a stepladder to show the upholsterer, who did not understand how he wanted the hangings draped, he made a false step and slipped. But being a strong and agile man, he clung on and only knocked his side against the knob of the window frame. The bruised place was painful, but the pain soon passed, and he felt particularly bright and well just then. He wrote, "I feel 15 years younger." He thought he would have everything ready by September, but it dragged on till mid-October. But the result was charming not only in his eyes, but to everyone who saw it. In reality, it was just what is usually seen in the houses of people of moderate means who want to appear rich, and therefore succeed only in resembling others like themselves. There are damasks, dark wood, plants, rugs, and dull and polished bronzes. All the things people of a certain class have in order to resemble other people of that class. His house was so like the others that it would never have been noticed, but to him it all seemed to be quite exceptional. He was very happy when he met his family at the station and brought them to the newly furnished house, all lit up, where a footman in a white tie opened the door into the hall decorated with plants, and when they went on into the drawing room and the study, uttering exclamations of delight, he conducted them everywhere, drank in their praises eagerly, and beamed with pleasure. At tea that evening, when Praskovya Fyodorovna, among other things, asked him about his fall, he laughed and showed them how he had gone flying and had frightened the upholsterer. "No, it's a good thing I'm a bit of an athlete. Another man might have been killed, but I merely knocked myself just here. It hurts when it's touched, but it's passing off already. It's only a bruise." So they began living in their new home, in which, as always happens, when they got thoroughly settled in, they found they were just one room short. And with the increased income, which, as always, was just a little, some 500 rubles, too little, but it was all very nice. Things went particularly well at first, before everything was finally arranged and while something had still to be done. This thing bought, that thing ordered, another thing moved, and something else adjusted. Though there were some disputes between husband and wife, they were both so well satisfied and had so much to do that it all passed off without any serious quarrels. When nothing was left to arrange, it became rather dull, and some things seemed to be lacking. But they were then making acquaintances, forming habits, and life was growing fuller. Ivan Ilych spent his mornings at the law court and came home to dinner, and at first he was generally in a good humor, though he occasionally became irritable just on account of his house. Every spot on the tablecloth or the upholstery, and every broken window blind string irritated him. He had devoted so much trouble to arranging it all that every disturbance of it distressed him. But on the whole, his life ran its course as he believed life should do, easily, pleasantly, and decorously. He got up at 9, drank his coffee, read the paper, and then put on his undress uniform and went to the law courts. There, the harness in which he worked had already been stretched to fit him, and he donned it without a hitch. Petitioners, inquiries at the Chancery itself, and the sittings, public and administrative. In all this, the thing was to exclude everything fresh and vital, which always disturbs the regular course of official business, and to admit only official relations with people, and then only on official grounds. A man would come, for instance, wanting some information. Ivan Ilych, as one in whose sphere the matter did not lie, would have nothing to do with him. But if the man had some business with him in his official capacity, something that could be expressed on officially stamped paper, he would do everything, positively everything he could, within the limits of such relations, and in doing so would maintain the semblance of friendly human relations, that is, would observe the courtesies of life. As soon as the official relations ended, so did everything else. Ivan Ilych possessed this capacity to separate his real life from the official side of affairs and not mix the two in the highest degree, and by long practice and natural aptitude had brought it to such a pitch that sometimes, in the manner of a virtuoso, he would even allow himself to let the human and official relations mingle. He let himself do this just because he felt that he could, at any time he chose, resume the strictly official attitude again and drop the human relation. And he did it all easily, pleasantly, correctly, and even artistically. In the intervals between the sessions, he smoked, drank tea, chatted a little about politics, a little about general topics, a little about cards, but most of all about official appointments. Tired, but with the feelings of a virtuoso, one of the first violins who has played his part in an orchestra with precision, he would return home to find that his wife and daughter had been out paying calls or had a visitor, and that his son had been to school, had done his homework with his tutor, and was surely learning what is taught at high schools. Everything was as it should be. After dinner, if they had no visitors, Ivan Ilych sometimes read a book that was being much discussed at the time, and in the evening settled down to work, that is, read official papers, compared the depositions of witnesses, and noted paragraphs of the code applying to them. This was neither dull nor amusing. It was dull when he might have been playing bridge, but if no bridge was available, it was at any rate better than doing nothing or sitting with his wife. Ivan Ilych's chief pleasure was giving little dinners to which he invited men and women of good social position. And just as his drawing room resembled all other drawing rooms, so did his enjoyable little parties resemble all other such parties. Once they even gave a dance. Ivan Ilyich enjoyed it, and everything went off well, except that it led to a violent quarrel with his wife about the cakes and sweets. Praskovya Fedorovna had made her own plans, but Ivan Ilyich insisted on getting everything from an expensive confectioner and ordered too many cakes. And the quarrel occurred because some of the cakes were left over, and the confectioner's bill came to 45 rubles. It was a great and disagreeable quarrel. Praskovya Feodorovna called him a fool and an imbecile, and he clutched at his head and made angry allusions to divorce. But the dance itself had been enjoyable. The best people were there, and Ivan Ilyich had danced with Princess Trufonova, a sister of the distinguished founder of the society Bear My Burden. The pleasures connected with his work were pleasures of ambition. His social pleasures were those of vanity. But Ivan Ilych's greatest pleasure was playing bridge. He acknowledged that whatever disagreeable incident happened in his life, the pleasure that beamed like a ray of light above everything else was to sit down to bridge with good players, not noisy partners, and, of course, to four-handed bridge. With 5 players, it was annoying to have to stand out, though one pretended not to mind, to play a clever and serious game when the cards allowed it, and then to have supper and drink a glass of wine. After a game of bridge, especially if he'd won a little, to win a large sum was unpleasant, Ivan Ilyich went to bed in especially good humor. So they lived. They formed a circle of acquaintances among the best people and were visited by people of importance and by young folk. In their views as to their acquaintances, husband, wife, and daughter were entirely agreed, and tacitly and unanimously kept at arm's length and shook off the various shabby friends and relations who, with much show of affection, gushed into the drawing room with its Japanese plates on the walls. Soon these shabby friends ceased to obtrude themselves, and only the best people remained in the Golovin set. Young men made up to Lisa, and Petrishchev, an examining magistrate, and Dmitri Ivanovich, Petrishchev's son and sole heir, began to be so attentive to her that Ivan Ilyich had already spoken to Praskovya Feodorovna about it and considered whether they should not arrange a party for them or get up some private theatricals. So they lived, and all went well, without change, and life flowed pleasantly. Chapter 4. They were all in good health. It could not be called ill health if Ivan Ilyich sometimes said that he had a queer taste in his mouth and felt some discomfort in his left side. But this discomfort increased, and though not exactly painful, grew into a sense of pressure in his side, accompanied by ill humor, and his irritability became worse and worse and began to mar the agreeable, easy, and correct life that had established itself in the Golovine family. Quarrels between husband and wife became more and more frequent, and soon the ease and amenity disappeared, and even the decorum was barely maintained. Scenes again became frequent, and very few of those islets remained on which husband and wife could meet without an explosion. Praskovya Fyodorovna now had good reason to say that her husband's temper was trying. With characteristic exaggeration, she said he had always had a dreadful temper, and that it had needed all her good nature to put up with it for 20 years. It was true that now the quarrels were started by him. His bursts of temper always came just before dinner, often just as he began to eat his soup. Sometimes he noticed that a plate or dish was chipped, or the food was not right, or his son put his elbow on the table, or his daughter's hair was not done as he liked it. And for all this, he blamed Praskovya Fyodorovna. At first, she retorted and said disagreeable things to him, but once or twice he fell into such a rage at the beginning of dinner that she realized it was due to some physical derangement brought on by taking food. And so she restrained herself and did not answer, but only hurried to get the dinner over. She regarded this self-restraint as highly praiseworthy. Having come to the conclusion that her husband had a dreadful temper and made her life miserable, she began to feel sorry for herself, and the more she pitied herself, the more she hated her husband. She began to wish he would die. Yet she did not want him to die, because then his salary would cease, and this irritated her against him still more. She considered herself dreadfully unhappy just because not even his death could save her. And though she concealed her exasperation, that hidden exasperation of hers increased his irritation also. After one scene in which Ivan Ilych had been particularly unfair, and after which he had said in explanation that he certainly was irritable, but that it was due to his not being well, she said that if he was ill, it should be attended to, and insisted on his going to see a celebrated doctor. He went. Everything took place as he had expected, and as it always does. There was the usual waiting, and the important air assumed by the doctor, with which he was so familiar, resembling that which he himself assumed in court, and the sounding and listening, and the questions which called for answers that were foregone conclusions and were evidently unnecessary, and the look of importance which implied that if only you put yourself in our hands, we will arrange everything. We know indubitably how it has to be done, always in the same way for everybody alike. It was all just as it was in the law courts. The doctor put on just the same air towards him as he himself put on towards an accused person. The doctor said that so-and-so indicated that there was so-and-so inside the patient, but if the investigation of so-and-so did not confirm this, then he must assume that and that. If he assumed that and that, then... and so on. To Ivan Ilych, only one question was important. Was his case serious or not? But the doctor ignored that inappropriate question. From his point of view, it was not the one under consideration. The real question was to decide between a floating kidney, chronic catarrh, or appendicitis. It was not a question the doctor solved brilliantly, as it seemed to Ivan Ilych, in favor of the appendix, with the reservation that should an examination of the urine give fresh indications, the matter would be reconsidered. All this was just what Ivan Ilych had himself brilliantly accomplished 1,000 times in dealing with men on trial. The doctor summed up just as brilliantly, looking over his spectacles triumphantly and even gaily at the accused. From the doctor's summing up, Ivan Ilych concluded that things were bad, but that for the doctor, and perhaps for everybody else, it was a matter of indifference, though for him it was bad. And this conclusion struck him painfully, arousing in him a great feeling of pity for himself and of bitterness towards the doctor's indifference to a matter of such importance. He said nothing of this, but rose, placed the doctor's fee on the table, and remarked with a sigh, "We sick people probably often put inappropriate questions, but tell me, in general, is this complaint dangerous or not?" The doctor looked at him sternly over his spectacles with one eye, as if to say, "Prisoner, if you will not keep to the questions put to you, I shall be obliged to have you removed from the court. I have already told you what I consider necessary and proper. The analysis may show something more." And the doctor bowed. Ivan Ilych went out slowly, seated himself disconsolately in his sledge, and drove home. All the way home he was going over what the doctor had said, trying to translate those complicated, obscure scientific phrases into plain language and find in them an answer to the question, is my condition bad? Is it very bad? Or is there as yet nothing much wrong? And it seemed to him that the meaning of what the doctor had said was that it was very bad. Everything in the street seemed depressing. The cabmen, the houses, the passers-by, and the shops were dismal. His ache, this dull, gnawing ache that never ceased for a moment, seemed to have acquired a new and more serious significance from the doctor's dubious remarks. Ivan Ilych now watched it with a new and oppressive feeling. He reached home and began to tell his wife about it. She listened, but in the middle of his account his daughter came in with her hat on, ready to go out with her mother. She sat down reluctantly to listen to this tedious story, but could not stand it long, and her mother, too, did not hear him to the end. "Well, I'm very glad," she said. "Mind now to take your medicine regularly. Give me the prescription, and I'll send Gerasim to the chemist's." And she went to get ready to go out. While she was in the room, Ivan Ilych had hardly taken time to breathe, but he sighed deeply when she left it. Well, he thought, perhaps it isn't so bad after all. He began taking his medicine and following the doctor's directions, which had been altered after the examination of the urine. But then it happened that there was a contradiction between the indications drawn from the examination of the urine and the symptoms that showed themselves. It turned out that what was happening differed from what the doctor had told him, and that he'd either forgotten or blundered or hidden something from him. He could not, however, be blamed for that, and Ivan Ilych still obeyed his orders implicitly, and at first derived some comfort from doing so. From the time of his visit to the doctor, Ivan Illich's chief occupation was the exact fulfillment of the doctor's instructions regarding hygiene and the taking of medicine, and the observation of his pain and his excretions. His chief interest came to be people's ailments and people's health. When sickness, deaths, or recoveries were mentioned in his presence, especially when the illness resembled his own, he listened with agitation, which he tried to hide, asked questions, and applied what he heard to his own case. The pain did not grow less. But Ivan Ilych made efforts to force himself to think that he was better, and he could do this so long as nothing agitated him. But as soon as he had any unpleasantness with his wife, any lack of success in his official work, or held bad cards at bridge, he was at once acutely sensible of his disease. He had formerly borne such mischances, hoping soon to adjust what was wrong, to master it and attain success, or make a grand slam. But now every mischance upset him and plunged him into despair. He would say to himself, "There now, just as I was beginning to get better and the medicine had begun to take effect, comes this accursed misfortune or unpleasantness." And he was furious with the mishap, or with the people who were causing the unpleasantness and killing him, for he felt that this fury was killing him, but he could not restrain it. One would have thought that it should have been clear to him that this exasperation with circumstances and people aggravated his illness, and that he ought therefore to ignore unpleasant occurrences. But he drew the very opposite conclusion. He said that he needed peace, and he watched for everything that might disturb it and became irritable at the slightest infringement of it. His condition was rendered worse by the fact that he read medical books and consulted doctors. The progress of his disease was so gradual that he could deceive himself when comparing one day with another. The difference was so slight. But when he consulted the doctors, it seemed to him that he was getting worse, and even very rapidly. Yet despite this, he was continually consulting them. That month, he went to see another celebrity who told him almost the same as the first had done, but put his questions rather differently, and the interview with this celebrity only increased Ivan Ilych's doubts and fears. A friend of his, a very good doctor, diagnosed his illness again quite differently from the others, and though he predicted recovery, his questions and suppositions bewildered Ivan Ilych still more and increased his doubts. A homeopathist diagnosed the disease in yet another way and prescribed medicine which Ivan Ilych took secretly for a week. But after a week, not feeling any improvement and having lost confidence both in the former doctor's treatment and in this one's, he became still more despondent. One day, a lady acquaintance mentioned a cure effected by a wonder-working icon. Ivan Ilych caught himself listening attentively and beginning to believe that it had occurred. This incident alarmed him. "Has my mind really weakened to such an extent?" he asked himself. "Nonsense. It's all rubbish. I mustn't give way to nervous fears, but having chosen a doctor, must keep strictly to his treatment. That is what I will do. Now, it's all settled. I won't think about it, but will follow the treatment seriously till summer, and then we shall see. From now, there must be no more of this wavering." This was easy to say, but impossible to carry out. Pain in his side oppressed him and seemed to grow worse and more incessant, whilst the taste in his mouth grew stranger and stranger. It seemed to him that his breath had a disgusting smell, and he was conscious of a loss of appetite and strength. There was no deceiving himself. Something terrible, new, and more important than anything before in his life was taking place within him, of which he alone was aware. Those about him did not understand or would not understand it, but thought everything in the world was going on as usual. That tormented Ivan Ilych more than anything. He saw that his household, especially his wife and daughter, who were in a perfect whirl of visiting, did not understand anything of it, and were annoyed that he was so depressed and so exacting, as if he were to blame for it. Though they tried to disguise it, he saw that he was an obstacle in their path, and that his wife had adopted a definite line in regard to his illness and kept to it regardless of anything he said or did. Her attitude was this: "You know," she would say to her friends, "Ivan Ilych can't do as other people do and keep to the treatment prescribed for him. One day he'll take his drops and keep strictly to his diet and go to bed in good time. But the next day, unless I watch him, he'll suddenly forget his medicine, eat sturgeon, which is forbidden, and sit up playing cards till 1 o'clock in the morning." "Oh, come, when was that?" Ivan Ilych would ask in vexation. "Only once at Pyotr Ivanovitch's. And yesterday with Shebek? Well, even if I hadn't stayed up, this pain would have kept me awake. Be that as it may, you'll never get well like that, but will always make us wretched." Praskovya Fyodorovna's attitude to Ivan Ilych's illness, as she expressed it both to others and to him, was that it was his own fault and was another of the annoyances he caused her. Ivan Ilych felt that this opinion escaped her involuntarily, but that did not make it easier for him. At the law courts, too, Ivan Ilych noticed, or thought he noticed, a strange attitude towards himself. It sometimes seemed to him that people were watching him inquisitively, as a man whose place might soon be vacant. Then again, his friends would suddenly begin to chaff him in a friendly way about his low spirits, as if the awful, horrible, and unheard-of thing that was going on within him, incessantly gnawing at him and irresistibly drawing him away, was a very agreeable subject for jests. Schwartz, in particular, irritated him by his jocularity, vivacity, and savoir-faire, which reminded him of what he himself had been 10 years ago. Friends came to make up a set, and they sat down to cards. They dealt, bending the new cards to soften them, and he sorted the diamonds in his hand and found he had 7. His partner said no trumps and supported him with 2 diamonds. What more could be wished for? It ought to be jolly and lively. They would make a grand slam. But suddenly, Ivan Ilych was conscious of that gnawing pain, that taste in his mouth, and it seemed ridiculous that in such circumstances he should be pleased to make a grand slam. He looked at his partner, Mikhail Mikhailovich, who rapped the table with his strong hand, and instead of snatching up the tricks, pushed the cards courteously and indulgently towards Ivan Ilych, that he might have the pleasure of gathering them up without the trouble of stretching out his hand for them. "Does he think I'm too weak to stretch out my arm?" thought Ivan Ilych, and forgetting what he was doing, he over-trumped his partner, missing the grand slam by 3 tricks. And what was most awful of all was that he saw how upset Mikhail Mikhailovich was about it, but did not himself care. And it was dreadful to realize why he did not care. They all saw that he was suffering and said, "We can stop if you're tired. Take a rest." Lie down? No, he was not at all tired, and he finished the rubber. All were gloomy and silent. Ivan Ilych felt that he had diffused this gloom over them and could not dispel it. They had supper and went away, and Ivan Ilych was left alone with the consciousness that his life was poisoned and was poisoning the lives of others, and that this poison did not weaken but penetrated more and more deeply into his whole being. With this consciousness, and with physical pain besides the terror, he must go to bed, often to lie awake the greater part of the night. Next morning he had to get up again, dress, go to the law courts, speak and write, or if he did not go out, spend at home those 24 hours a day, each of which was a torture. And he had to live thus all alone on the brink of an abyss, with no one who understood or pitied him. Chapter 5. So 1 month passed, and then another. Just before the new year, his brother-in-law came to town and stayed at their house. Ivan Ilych was at the law courts, and Praskovya Fyodorovna had gone shopping. When Ivan Ilych came home and entered his study, he found his brother-in-law there, a healthy, florid man, unpacking his portmanteau himself. He raised his head on hearing Ivan Ilych's footsteps and looked up at him for a moment without a word. That stare told Ivan Ilych everything. His brother-in-law opened his mouth to utter an exclamation of surprise, but checked himself, and that action confirmed it all. "I have changed, eh?" Yes, there is a change." And after that, try as he would to get his brother-in-law to return to the subject of his looks, the latter would say nothing about it. Praskovya Fyodorovna came home, and her brother went out to her. Ivan Ilych locked the door and began to examine himself in the glass, first full face, then in profile. He took up a portrait of himself taken with his wife and compared it with what he saw in the glass. The change in him was immense. Then he bared his arms to the elbow, looked at them, drew the sleeves down again, sat down on an ottoman, and grew blacker than night. No, this won't do," he said to himself, and jumped up, went to the table, took up some law papers and began to read them, but could not continue. He unlocked the door and went into the reception room. The door leading to the drawing room was shut. He approached it on tiptoe and listened. "No, you are exaggerating," Praskovya Fyodorovna was saying. "Exaggerating? Don't you see it? Why, he's a dead man. Look at his eyes. There's no life in them. But what is it that is wrong with him?" "No one knows. Nikolaevich, that was another doctor, said something, but I don't know what. And Leshchetitsky, this was the celebrated specialist, said quite the contrary." Ivan Ilych walked away, went to his own room, lay down, and began musing. The kidney, a floating kidney. He recalled all the doctors had told him of how it detached itself and swayed about. And by an effort of imagination, he tried to catch that kidney and arrest it and support it. So little was needed for this, it seemed to him. "No, I'll go to see Pyotr Ivanovich again." But that was the friend whose friend was a doctor. He rang, ordered the carriage, and got ready to go. "Where are you going, Jean?" asked his wife with a specially sad and exceptionally kind look. This exceptionally kind look irritated him. He looked morosely at her. "I must go to see Pyotr Ivanovich." He went to see Pyotr Ivanovich, and together they went to see his friend the doctor. He was in, and Ivan Ilych had a long talk with him. Reviewing the anatomical and physiological details of what, in the doctor's opinion, was going on inside him, he understood it all. There was something, a small thing, in the vermiform appendix. It might all come right. Only stimulate the energy of one organ and check the activity of another, then absorption would take place and everything would come right. He got home rather late for dinner, ate his dinner, and conversed cheerfully, but could not for a long time bring himself to go back to work in his room. At last, however, he went to his study and did what was necessary, but the consciousness that he had put something aside, an important, intimate matter which he would revert to when his work was done, never left him. When he had finished his work, he remembered that this intimate matter was the thought of his vermiform appendix. But he did not give himself up to it and went to the drawing room for tea. There were callers there, including the examining magistrate, who was a desirable match for his daughter, and they were conversing, playing the piano and singing. Ivan Ilych, as Praskovya Fyodorovna remarked, spent that evening more cheerfully than usual, but he never for a moment forgot that he had postponed the important matter of the appendix. At 11 o'clock he said good night and went to his bedroom. Since his illness, he had slept alone in a small room next to his study. He undressed and took up a novel by Zola, but instead of reading it, he fell into thought, and in his imagination that desired improvement in the vermiform appendix occurred. There was the absorption and evacuation and the re-establishment of normal activity. Yes, that's it, he said to himself. One need only assist nature, that's all. He remembered his medicine, rose, took it, and lay down on his back, watching for the beneficent action of the medicine and for it to lessen the pain. I need only take it regularly and avoid all injurious influences. I am already feeling better, much better. He began touching his side. It was not painful to the touch. There, I really don't feel it. It's much better already. He put out the light and turned on his side. The appendix is getting better. Absorption is occurring. Suddenly, he felt the old, familiar, dull, gnawing pain, stubborn and serious. There was the same familiar, loathsome taste in his mouth. His heart sank, and he felt dazed. My God, he muttered. Again, and it will never cease. And suddenly the matter presented itself in a quite different aspect. Vermiform appendix, kidney, he said to himself. It's not a question of appendix or kidney, but of life and death. Yes, life was there, and now it is going, and I cannot stop it. Yes, why deceive myself? Isn't it obvious to everyone but me that I'm dying? And that it's only a question of weeks, days? It may happen this moment. There was light, and now there is darkness. I was here, and now I'm going there. Where? A chill came over him. His breathing ceased, and he felt only the throbbing of his heart. When I am not, what will there be? There will be nothing. Then where shall I be when I am no more? Can this be dying? No, I don't want to. He jumped up and tried to light the candle, felt for it with trembling hands, dropped candle and candlestick on the floor, and fell back on his pillow. What's the use? It makes no difference, he said to himself, staring with wide-open eyes into the darkness. Death. Yes, death. And none of them knows or wishes to know it, and they have no pity for me. Now they are playing. He heard through the door the distant sound of a song and its accompaniment. It's all the same to them, but they will die too. Fools. I first and they later, but it'll be the same for them. And now they are merry, the beasts. Anger choked him, and he was agonizingly, unbearably miserable. It is impossible that all men have been doomed to suffer this awful horror. He raised himself. Something must be wrong. I must calm myself, must think it all over from the beginning. He again began thinking, yes, the beginning of my illness. I knocked my side, but I was still quite well that day and the next. It hurt a little, then rather more. I saw the doctors, then followed despondency and anguish, more doctors, and I drew nearer to the abyss. My strength grew less, and I kept coming nearer and nearer, and now I have wasted away, and there is no light in my eyes. I think of the appendix, but this is death. I think of mending the appendix, and all the while here is death. Can it really be death? Again, terror seized him and he gasped for breath. He leant down and began feeling for the matches, pressing with his elbow on the stand beside the bed. It was in his way and hurt him. He grew furious with it, pressed on it still harder and upset it. Breathless and in despair, he fell on his back, expecting death to come immediately. Meanwhile, the visitors were leaving. Praskovya Fyodorovna was seeing them off. She heard something fall and came in. What has happened? Nothing. I knocked it over accidentally. She went out and returned with a candle. He lay there, panting heavily, like a man who has run 1,000 yards, and stared upwards at her with a fixed look. What is it, Jean? Nothing. I upset it. Why speak of it? She won't understand, he thought. And in truth, she did not understand. She picked up the stand, lit his candle, and hurried away to see another visitor off. When she came back, he still lay on his back, looking upwards. What is it? Do you feel worse? Yes. She shook her head and sat down. Do you know, Jean, I think we must ask Leschetitsky to come and see you here. This meant calling in the famous specialist, regardless of expense. He smiled malignantly and said, no. She remained a little longer and then went up to him and kissed his forehead. While she was kissing him, he hated her from the bottom of his soul and with difficulty refrained from pushing her away. Good night. Please God you'll sleep. Yes,